What's up, everybody watching on YouTube, and welcome back to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and we're here for yet another episode of the Horsemen podcast, but a very, very different episode. I'm all by myself with a special guest. We'll get to him in just a moment. I do want to say apologies for anyone who is hoping to see Artur, Hannah, Ricky, or Mr. Fireblade, or even Kamikaze. Sadly, none of them could make it tonight, or didn't have their lists ready, so I'm flying solo with a special guest, and my special guest, please welcome newcomer to the Horseman podcast family, the man that calls himself Scott, Mr. Scott Reacts. How you doing tonight, Scott? And I completely butchered that intro. but it's all fun and games for me because I'm used to it.
No problem, Glam Maniac 86. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this pod. Does this mean I'm a horseman now?
Yep, you are the seventh horseman on the show.
Oh, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Shit, am I Paul Roma?
Oh, no.
God, man, come on.
And for those of you who don't know, Scott actually has a YouTube channel called Mr. Scott Reacts. How many subscribers do you have? Last I saw you had like 500 or 600.
I have just broke, at the time of this recording, 670.
Good job. So and definitely...
I actually got 666 on Halloween.
Illuminati confirmed.
Yes.
So I'll put a link in the description for his channel. He does reaction videos to music, to wrestling, to epic rap battles of history, the whole 9 yards. Mm-hmm. And he does a good job at what he does. And a little backstory, we were talking about this prior to recording, that Scott, you used to be a professional wrestler.
I worked the independent wrestling scene in the Northeast. Started as a ring announcer in December of 1998. And I got to ring announce, referee. I worked behind the scenes as a matchmaker, booker. Eventually became a wrestler full time. Wrestled in New York, Vermont. I trained under one of the greatest NWA world champions of all time, Dory Funk Jr., in April of 2000 at one of his conservatory camps. It was a great time down there. Learned a lot down there on Coach Funk. Got to work for Ring of Honor on the ring crew there when they first started. My good friend Matt Knowles, who wrestles as H.C. Loke, he was in ECW as the Extreme Official. He was Ring of Honor World Tag Team Champion. Old friend of mine, known him for years, and he was in charge of the ring crew, so I used to work for him on the ring crew. Got to meet some of the biggest names in the business who are all now a part of the biggest companies and matches in the world nowadays.
Yep.
And got to wrestle, book, and all that stuff. 16 years. I left the business in 2015 to start getting into podcasting. Eventually got into doing the YouTube channel, and here we are. So.
And we're glad to have you in, man. It's really, really cool. And fun fact, how I discovered this guy, I actually haven't told them this yet, so this is going to be breaking news for him. We were talking a little bit about NASCAR, because he said he married into a NASCAR family. Mm-hmm. In one of the TeamSpeak server that I'm a part of, called the Racing Corps, the main woman behind it, Jessica Sheldon, she introduced me to this guy because she loves epic rap battles of history and saw that you was doing reactions to him and thought, you know what, because she looked into you being a former wrestler and likes metal and said this might be something up your alley. I was like, cool, and I checked them out, and here we are doing this show.
Yeah, and you gave me that shout out on your channel one time, and then I found that, and that just connected us from there.
Yeah. So perhaps out of any guest, well, you're only our second guest we've ever had on the show. Out of between you and Kamikaze, even though Kamikaze's a wrestling guy and a metal guy, but me and him mostly bond over NASCAR. I think you and I bond better than any of the other people on the show because you like metal and wrestling. Yes. Which is fucking fantastic. So
yes, two passions. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and you can definitely tell he's into both because I could see in the background he's got 2 championship belts and a slew of guitars.
Yep, I got 7 over here and 2 in the closet. So I had 13. I'm down to 9.
Ah.
Yep. Had to wean them down a little bit there, but yeah, I got Rick and Rich, the Rickenbacker and the Beastie Rich over there. Got my Stratocaster. Couple of acoustics, my 5-string bass, and my 4-string Squire Badass that I just like to pound on every once in a while.
Yeah, and I remembered, I think one of the first times you and I really talked was on a live stream you did,
Yep.
where you was jamming away at your bass. I would get mine out, but I don't feel like reaching all the way next to my TV. Plus, it's missing a string, and it's a bass that my late grandfather gave me a few months before he died, so I pretty much now cherish it with my life. Even though I need to get new strings, apart from missing one, but they're rusted out because my hands sweat a lot. And then over here, I do have an acoustic that I haven't played in a while because it's also missing a string, but we got a spare acoustic downstairs that I like to play root notes a lot. I can't do chords. I'm terrible at chords. I'm more of a root note player. That's why I prefer playing bass.
Do the bass. Yeah, I started on bass, eventually taught myself guitar, so just because all my friends were playing guitar, and just like that, I just learned from watching from them. So, and matter of fact, fun fact too, later on I'll show you this. One of my acoustics I have over there is signed by Jeff Jarrett, because he was on one of the shows that I booked. Matter of fact, the last show I did, he was one of our guests that night, and I had him sign it. And because he was a big influence on my wife getting into the business. Yes, my wife was in the wrestling business too. That's how we met. We have the greatest meeting story of all time. So as we were saying earlier, unless you meet somebody online playing Twitch or whatever, you know.
And we were making jokes about that earlier. What if there'd be a website called Twitch Pitches or something, or
Twitch
or
Pitches.
Twitch Dating, where it's 90% dudes.
Dudes.
But we could go on and on about the jokes. So now to the next part. How did you get into metal or rock music in general? And I bet that's a big story.
Yeah, it goes back to when I was a kid. My sister was into that sound. Just to put in context, I'm 44 years old, and my sister is 4 years older than me. So I'm 9 years old, listening to Ozzy, Motley Crue, Wasp, Iron Maiden, all these different bands, throbbing out of her bedroom stereo, and it just would fill up the entire house when my parents weren't home. So it just by repetition, I just became a fan of it. And back in my day, there was this thing called MTV that played music videos. I know they don't do that anymore. And we also had this thing called a VCR that would record the videos. So we'd stick the tape in there. We would just record random videos. I still have those tapes to this day in a big trunk over here. And that was where it first kind of started. And I was listening to all different kinds of music as a kid. Mostly the rock stuff really kind of screamed to me. My sister bought me a couple of Ozzy albums when I was around 9, 10 years old. And it just kind of flourished from there. And eventually when I started taking bass guitar, I was 16 years old. And that's right around when the Black Album came out from Metallica. And that kind of led me down the path to their earlier stuff. I fell in love with Cliff Burton, who is one of my all-time favorite influences. You can see it on the wall right there is a drawing that a friend of mine, who's an artist named Azrael Mordecai, drew that picture there. It's Cliff Burton. He did that freehand, and that's a picture of one of Cliff's most infamous poses. Right down to the ring on his finger, to the Misfits shirt he's wearing, to the Misfits font that the name is written on. It's one of my prized possessions right there. So big shout out to my buddy Azrael Mordecai, who made that incredible artist. So Cliff was a big influence, and got into, of course, Motorhead. Lemmy is a huge influence on me too, musically. And just the more guys that I hung out with started getting me into more extreme music and listening to more heavier thrash, got me into death metal, got me into grindcore, got me into hardcore, got me into all different types, black metal and so forth, and all different kinds of that extreme style. So, and as we discuss our topic tonight, I'll get into the list, and a lot of the albums I'm going to talk about were all directly influenced on me starting to learn how to write music a different way and arrange music a little differently, because you're listening. It got so formulaic in the 80s with thrash metal, and I love thrash metal. When you got into the 90s, all these heavier death bands started coming up with this whole new way of writing and arranging music that was just mind-blowing. So that kind of led to that.
So a little refresher for the people who may not have seen the podcast in a while or may not particularly know my entry point to the music because I'd not told Scott this, so I figured it'd be a good point of conversation. How I got into how I got into metal and rock is very unorthodox. I mean, at first, the typicals, the familials, your parents, brothers. At first, it was my parents because they love classic rock. So I got early on into AC/DC, Steve Miller Band, Jethro Tull, CCR, whatever was on the radio on our station, 107.5, which was like the classic rock station in the Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia tri-state area where I live. So it started with that, and then I think around that time when I got into that, I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. Then at around 6 or 7 years old, so early 2000s, my oldest brother, Rue, as we called him, his real name Andrew, God rest his soul, I miss him to this day, he was 14 years older than me. So if he was still around, he'd be 39. He at first got me into hip-hop, like Jay-Z, Eminem, and I do have a slight soft spot for old hip-hop, even though apart from rap metal, I have not listened to straight-up rap in a long time. So at first, he got me into that, but I saw, and this was back in the day where there was illegal downloadings all over the place. The one that we used to have on our old computers, remember the days when you had old computers that didn't have much? There was this program called Kazaa where they would just go on there and get whatever they could find. One of the first rock or metal songs I truly fell in love with, even though it's maybe one of the band's lower tier songs, I Disappear by Metallica, because this was around the time Mission Impossible 2 came out.
That was the big Napster controversy song.
Yep, absolutely. So that was what got me hooked at first. Then I got into listening to the old catalog, like Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. But the album Load was a big album for me in my childhood growing up, because they had that album. I would just take it from them, listen to it in my little CD player. Remember the days when there was little CD players? Portables? I would take it every day with me to school. Every morning and afternoon on the bus, I would just listen to mostly wrestlers' theme songs, but I would have burnt CDs with different songs. Or listen to the Load album and mostly listen to the songs King Nothing and Bleeding Me. Those are like my two favorites for a long time. Yep. Then after Metallica, thanks to video game soundtracks, I got into other bands. The next big one being Avenged Sevenfold, who's still my second favorite band of all time. So I got into them. Then a couple years later, when Fuse channel was still playing pretty much music, they would do their weekly countdowns for rock music, and I discovered Avenged Sevenfold again there. I'm like, where have I heard this name before? Oh yeah, from NASCAR Thunder 2004, and then I got into them even deeper, then back to Metallica, then by the time I turned teen, I got into Megadeth, Pantera, Slayer, Testament, got into thrash. Then eventually in high school, death metal and grindcore took over. Then, as years gone by, even up to this time, I've discovered more and eventually got heavy into progressive music, whether rock or metal, black metal, doom metal, death doom. I mean, hell, my craze right now is mostly death doom bands right now. Asphyx, Hooded Menace, Autopsy, the works. So, it's basically grown from there, and I think it's the same for pretty much any music fan. Yeah. They discover more and they get into more, and at times it's great, other times it's frustrating, especially for me when it comes to trying to review albums. There's so much out there that you can't get to it all at once.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one other big band that influenced me was, and this is funny to say, the band, of course, is Gwar. Why are they an influence is because when they first started, around 1989, when I was in high school, I had a small little clique of friends that we used to hang out with at lunchtime. And one of our friends brought in this cassette. So you're talking about CDs. I get to talk about cassettes. Brought in a cassette of Gwar's second album, Scumdogs of the Universe. If you don't know the album cover, go look at it right now, anybody out there listening, because it's the band in their costume standing in front of this like it's an iceberg, in the Arctic. But we're looking at this album cover like, do they actually wear these while they play? This was unheard of. So we take it home, you listen to it, it's like, this is great. It's good thrash. It's good good late 80s thrash metal. And when they also put out a live videotape called Live from Antarctica. It was actually filmed in Virginia, of course, we're from, but it was a live concert, and we watched this thing incessantly. And there was one close-up during one song of Mike, I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, who was Beefcake the Mighty, the bass player at the time. It was just this close-up of his fingers playing his Steinberger bass, which looked like a giant steak, the body, like that. And I saw that. I was mesmerized by that shot. And it was just like, I need to play bass. And that's what did it. That was the influence to me of actually saying, Ma, would you mind buying me a bass and pay for lessons? No problem. And she did. And that was, 1990, 1991. And it just went from there. So, wow. Yeah, Guar deserves a big shout out in my history. And rest in peace, Dave Brocky.
Yes.
And Corey Smoot. No disrespect to Corey Smoot. Yeah. So.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to the topic at hand. Our topic for this time, Top 10 Roadrunner Records albums. Brief history about Roadrunner. Roadrunner started all the way back in the 80s, at first known as Road Racer, or RC Records, before becoming Roadrunner in the late 80s, early 90s. And they were very much an unknown label in their early years, and I think the first couple of major releases from Roadrunner's past in their early years would have been albums from Merciful Fate and Carnivore in particular. Those two bands were like the key bands for the early years of the label before they really got going in the late 80s, early 90s. And we'll talk more about that with some of the albums that we both might have together. And as well as Ricky, who... Yeah, Ricky couldn't make it tonight because he was out tonight, but he did send me his list, so as we go through each of our lists, I'll shout out what Ricky had. So before we get to the actual list, we got some honorable mentions. Now, for Ricky, he had one honorable mention, Slipknot Volume 3, The Subliminal Verses. I'll comment on the album. Definitely it was a popular album for Slipknot. Hell, it had some of their biggest hits, like Before I Forget, Vermilion, and why am I blanking on the other big one?
Duplicity on there?
Duality. I knew that was one. I was like, why am I forgetting this? It's such a good song. And then some other underrated songs, but to me, not the best Slipknot album. That's their new album, in my opinion. We Are Not Your Kind, but that's his honorable mention. As for me, considering this was one of the toughest lists I had to put on, and I actually have a tie in the actual list, which we'll get into later. But I have 8 honorable mentions.
Oh, wow.
Because Roadrunner is a label near and dear to my heart. So, first couple, I actually have the physical copies right here. The first one, I have Cynic Focus, which one of the greatest progressive death metal jazz fusion combo albums in the history of metal. So, and not to mention, arguably one of the top 10 most underrated albums of all time. And then next up, son of a bitch, my voice is already going away, and we're not even 30 minutes in. But nonetheless, next up I have another one of my all-time favorites. Right now they would be like 12th or 13th on my top 20. Trivium Ascendancy, which, great thrash with some metalcore tendencies. A lot of people like to call this metalcore. I think the only thing that's metalcore is the good cop, bad cop vocals, because there are solos beyond solos on this thing. Some of my favorite all-time songs like Drowned and Torn Asunder, like Light to the Flies, among so many other classics. Back when Trivium was a rising band that was really making waves, mid-2000s. I brought up Carnivore earlier. I got Carnivore Retaliation, their second album, where New York crossover brutality by Peter Steele, holy balls. I mean, people go listen to this album and try and not laugh at some of the lyrics.
Oh, you can't help but laugh.
Yeah, because they're comical, but very also politically incorrect, which is a plus from me. Because I could go on and on about that. But next up, I have the album, which is probably the newest album on my list in general. Gojira L'Enfant Sauvage from 2012? Yeah, 2012. Especially love the song Born in Winter, one of the final songs on this album. And I even seen a video of a married couple having that song as their, like, wedding reception dance song, which was very strange.
I want to go to that wedding. Damn.
But you got other good ones like the title track, Explosia, the opening track, Pain as a Master. There's some great ones there. Slipknot, Iowa was my Slipknot choice for honorable mention. Next one, another one that I own. This one came close to making the top 10, but I got it in honorable mentions. Deicide self-titled debut. Fucking evil death metal, like on par with early Morbid Angel, except taking it even further with the lyrics, like Sacrificial Suicide and Blaspheria and Deicide. Glenn Benton, you are a fucking freak and funny.
Yes, he is. I'll get more into Glenn later on when we get to our...
Oh my god. Next up, more evil death metal, Immolation Dawn of Possession. I think this was actually their only album on Roadrunner, and it kind of sucks they didn't last too long. Then again, they didn't put out an album for another 5 years and then went to Metal Blade. But Dawn of Possession, I was actually listening to some of this album last night. Produced by Harris Johns over in Germany, not in Moorsound where the death metal production craze was happening. So they try to go outside the box, total respect for, and sounds evil and occultish, and what more could you ask for? And then my final honorable mention, brought up Peter Steele, I have Typo Negative, Bloody Kisses. In my opinion, the greatest gothic metal album of all time, where the band really truly went gothic metal straightforward without any thrash in there like their first couple of albums. And rest in peace, Peter Steele. When you got songs like Christian Woman, Black Number One, and even the cover of Summer Breeze, you know you got a great album on your hands with this. And even the title track, arguably one of the saddest songs in all of metal. So, Typo Negative, Bloody Kisses. Scott, do you have any honorable mentions?
You did way better research than I did. I didn't really make any mentions because I was looking at the list of Roadrunner albums and forgot, that a lot of these albums I remember growing up listening to were on Roadrunner. So I was like, oh shit, yeah, that one. Oh yeah, that one. Oh yeah, that one. Oh yeah, that one. So I basically took like 10 and just put them on my list. So the list I have is kind of interchangeable, and you could throw any of the other ones out there probably on the list. So I didn't really do any honorable mentions, but a couple you did mentions like Slipknot, Iowa. It's the only Slipknot album I ever owned. But again, it was another eye-opening, audible exploration because it was so different. And you had someone like, Corey Taylor. Okay, Corey, we get it. Needs to chill with himself sometimes. But he still was. He could. They with the band. Of course, they had the backing screams and so forth. But then you had Corey that could lay on this beautiful melody over top of all this chaos, and it does something to you mentally, and it touches you a little bit more in your psyche. That when you have this dichotomy of this rumbling chaos underneath and this beautiful high voice over top of it. And you can go back to bands like AC/DC and so forth that have that structure. They have that really high vocal and that low band. Covers all the bases and it kind of hits all the points. So that was one of the bands that did that. You got Carnivore in there. Bloody Kisses is on my list. We'll get to its number in a moment, of course. And Deicide's on my list too. Different album, but that's on there too. But yeah, Deicide as well. Listening to the first album and Aim and Feast and the Beast and just those freaking outfits that those guys would wear on stage back then. I've gotten to see Deicide live. When I saw them live, Glenn Benton did not talk a lot. Basically, the only banter he had between songs was going up to the microphone and going, "Sacrificial Suicide!" And then they start playing the song, and then play the entire set. And right before their final song, you went, "Last one, goodbye, see you next year."
He's like, just get straight to the point.
Yep. So I'll talk more about Glenn in a minute, but so Deicide's on there too, and yeah, there's so many bands and albums that we're going to be able to touch upon. So it should be fun.
And speaking of the top 10, let's get to the top 10, and then I'll begin at my number 10. This album, about 4 years ago, this and a couple other albums of theirs were so close to me, still is close to me, and this band basically went from being a band that I always heard about prior to 2014. I always heard about this band, but never listened to a full album of theirs because, good Lord, they got such an enormous discography. It's like, how do you tackle this band? I just got bored at one point and thought, you know what? I've been hearing about this band for years. Time to give it a shot. They are right now currently number 6 in my all-time bands list. Opeth, Ghost Reveries. I mean, Opeth, if you want to talk about musical geniuses, Opeth is one of the best bands, in my opinion, in the history of metal, because they're able, like you brought up with Slipknot, how Corey can have this wonderful melody over chaos. Similar aspect here with Opeth, progressive death metal with more emphasis this time on the progressive as opposed to the death metals. Like, a lot of people, and myself included, feel this was the transition album of them kind of slightly moving away from their death metal roots into the more progressive rock sound that they are now, with touches of metal, and you could still call it prog metal to some extent. But yeah, still got the growls. Michael Ackerfeld, in my opinion, top 4 death vocalist in the history of the genre. He can snarl, but when it comes to, like, me, because I like to sing sometimes, Michael's one of my biggest influences when it comes to singing, mostly the melody rather than the growls. Even though when I growl, I try to be like him, but I'm not that good. But with the melodies, I really like singing along to some of this stuff. Harlequin Forest alone is enough to put this album on anyone's list for top 10, whatever. Even Ghost of Perdition, The Grand Conjuration, Baying of the Hounds, and even the softer songs like Atonement, Hours of Wealth, Isolation Years. And the one that I got here, which was the 2-disc special edition, because it has the making of DVD and HD quality, has their cover of Deep Purple's Soldier of Fortune from the David Coverdale era. Which is really interesting considering, like, you listen to Coverdale's voice with Michael's melody, they sound very similar, so I can definitely tell Michael was inspired by David Coverdale when it comes to melodic vocals, and it certainly fits, and it's a good cover. So, sadly, last album with the great Martin Lopez, who's now in Soen, who kicks ass. But Ghost Reveries by Opeth, number 10. Nice. Ricky's number 10, on the other hand, once I get the list up, because I had to take snapshots, because it'd be too distracted for me to look on the computer and overlap the recording. So Ricky had a number 10, which I have on my list later, Fear Factory Demanufacture.
That's on my list too.
So that was Ricky's number 10. Scott, your number 10.
My number 10 is down under the boys from Florida with the classic 90s death metal, Deicide Legion. And,
that was the one I was thinking about. I was thinking either that or Once Upon the Cross, but I thought Legion was probably going to get it.
Yep. Yeah, Legion was was more my introduction to the band, I think, because again, it was that satanic imagery. It was fits they wore on stage, the battle armor, and all this stuff. And actually, I had this documentary about Satanism, and the funny thing about it was Deicide was featured on there. They showed them on stage with their outfits and all like that.
Yeah.
I think it was I forgot who was narrating the documentary, but during the course of the documentary, they interviewed Glenn Benton, and I always got respect for Glenn Benton because he's a carny, he's a worker. He should have been in pro wrestling because he knows how to work the audience and work people. and to get them to do what he wants to do and get his name out there and get exposure, which helped create the mystique of the band, which got them exposure, which got them album sales, and so forth and so on. It's business. I got nothing but respect for that. And he went on this satanic documentary, and it was funny to see Glenn young and clean shaven, by the way.
Yeah, and he's early 90s Glenn Benton.
Yes, exactly. And he's talking to the interviewer. He's looking off the side like this. And
I think I know which interview you're talking about. I've seen it on YouTube so many times.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, where he's just like, I believe in Satanism. It is my power. It is all this other stuff. And when the woman asks him, "Do you believe in demonic possession?" Of course I do. Do you believe you're possessed? Of course. Of course.
Do you find your music harmful? It depends on who's listening to it, but I don't see anything happening to them. Yeah.
Yep, there you go. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So yeah. It was, just that whole thing, just like, give me more of this. I want to know more about this band, and got a hold of Legion and listen to it incessantly. I mean, top that. Come on. It's very simple.
One of the masters of doing the high black metal screech with the low gutturals, One could argue Deicide's early material was blackened death metal, even though it was way more on the death metal end of the scale. But nobody wants to call them blackened death for some reason. I guess because they don't wear corpse paint, even though they probably should have.
That's the big difference, right? It goes back to Motorhead saying they thought they were a punk band, but you don't look like punks. You can't be a punk band. All right, fine. We're rock and roll.
It's the whole conundrum that nothing can get resolved, but nonetheless.
Yeah. So number 10, Legion, Deicide. Awesome stuff.
Well, why don't you get to your number 9? As
number 9.
If we had Hannah, she'd be going 9, 9, 9, 9, 9. Damn you, inglorious bastards.
Number 9 on my list is our mentions, and that is Typo Negative, Bloody Kisses. So, I mean, this album blew up huge. It was constantly on rotation on the radio, on the rock radio stations, on MTV. You had
Butthead.
Beavis and Butthead, yes. Yeah, you had the edited down versions of Christian Woman and Black Number 1 on there. And, I'm glad you referred to it as gothic metal and not doom, because it's technically not really doom. When you have songs like We Hate Everyone and Kill All White People on there,
oh, God.
you can't say it's really doom.
Especially when you have that humorous aspect, which some gothic metal has that.
Yeah, because Peter Steele was a total smartass Brooklyn boy, and they had that attitude. A friend of mine who's a filmmaker, an independent filmmaker, had Peter Steele in one of his movies. He just had a very big part in the movie. But there are outtakes of the times he had him on his movie, and it's just like this total ridiculous back and forth jokes they would throw in there and stuff. And so he was a big smartass. Matter of fact, I got to see Typo Negative live once. At the end of the show, they doused their audience with toilet paper, for God's sake. So you could not take this band that seriously. But it was a great show, and they had fun doing it. Yeah. And the show's over, and Peter is out there in the audience signing autographs. I ran up to him real quick with my ticket. He says, "Hey, man, how's it going?" He wrote that. I said, "Great show, man. Unbelievable. How do you come up with this stuff?" "I'm just a little fucked in the head."
And that was and who will ever forget the Howard Stern interview where he said Kurt Cobain's my biggest inspiration because he had the balls to kill himself. And they're like, "Are you depressed?" "I'm more like repressed." Peter was like the lovable, huggable, gentle giant that could just make you laugh all day long. And it's just shame we lost him 9 years ago.
Who would you want, Peter? Who do you want to be for Halloween? The Invisible Man.
Or Redneck Dracula. Let's go to a bar. Or sweeping Pantera's stage and sweeping villain Selmo off.
Yep.
I'll never forget that clip. My number 9.
Number 9.
Oh, God. We just worked ourselves up into a comedy frenzy.
Yes.
But my number 9... or actually, real quick, let me actually give Ricky's number 9 just to get that out of the way. Ricky's number 9. Now, this one I don't think should really count, because it was not primarily released on Roadrunner. It was only released at Roadrunner in the UK. It was released on Reprise Records, but Mastodon the Hunter, which, love the album, I don't think it quite counts because it wasn't primarily released on Roadrunner.
Okay.
There might be a bit of controversy with a couple of choices I have that may not have been recognized, but when you go to like websites, it's primarily Roadrunner, but we'll get to that later. But anyways, my number 9, talking about old school death metal, probably one of the earliest for Roadrunner at the time, Pestilence Consuming Impulse.
Oh, wow.
And the original cover with a bunch of cannibals and dead bodies. But that's pales in comparison to the alternate cover, ants eating your face. I mean, definitely more on the thrashy end of the death metal sound. Then again, early death metal was very thrash-oriented, so it made sense. And not to mention, my man Martin Van Drunen, maybe the greatest death metal vocalist of all time, arguably, because did it in a completely different fashion. I compare him and John Tardy, doing the more higher, tortured screams, as opposed to the lower sound that you would get from bands afterwards. But I mean, Out of the Body, Chronic Infection, Defy Thy Master, Echoes of Death. Words can't put it. I can't even put it into words how great this album. I thought about putting Malleus Maleficarum on the list, our first album, because that was definitely more straight up thrash, kind of like Sepultura and Creator and Metallica and Slayer. But this where the death metal era for Pestilence began, and sadly the last album with Martin, who'd eventually go on into Asphyx and fucking. I'll go ahead and say it right now. After Martin left Pestilence. Yeah, Testimony of the Ancients was a great album, but they were a shell of what they used to be. Like, once Martin went to Asphyx, I feel, this might be controversial, maybe not, Asphyx, overall better, discography-wise, than Pestilence. Where Pestilence, in my mind, first 3-4 albums, classics, after that, not so much. But that's one man's opinion, nonetheless.
That's fine.
But now on to, oh god, let's see if I can do this. Number 8. Damn you, Barney. Damn you, Barney Rubble. Oh god, I had leftovers right there. Whew.
Yes, so.
That tasted like pizza.
It's true.
Whew. Alright, so number 8. So Ricky on his
that was
number
a Simpsons
8.
reference. Anybody didn't get it, by the way.
I mean, it's kind of become synonymous with the show because every now and then I like to do it, and everybody on the show cracks up. Okay. Ricky's number 8 was Slipknot 0.5 to Grey Chapter, which is a very interesting choice. Definitely a good album nonetheless, but maybe not the one you would think about being on a list like this. But my number 8 is one that I unfortunately don't have, but plan to get someday. And this is another one of those albums where you can't think of Roadrunner Records without thinking about this album, King Diamond Abigail. It's King Diamond, one of my all-time favorite people in metal, one of the arguably the best metal vocalist ever because of the classic falsetto that if, I don't know, let's see if I could try real quick and hopefully I don't wake anybody up downstairs.
That was good. That was good.
I like to do the falsetto at times, especially when I'm singing along the Merciful Fate or King Diamond songs. But yeah, Abigail, arguably the best album King Diamond released in a solo band. Some could say Them. The follow-up was just as good, if not better, or even The Eye. But I mean, Abigail is the most famous one. Concept album, arguably one of the greatest concept albums in the history of metal. The title track alone, what the hell was that song? The Black Horsemen, I believe. Yeah. Another classic on there. I mean, there's... Yep. Especially the album cover with the trolley and the horses in the dark with the purple shading, which makes it look even more eerie. Then again, purple in general is an eerie color, so... But yeah, King Diamond Abigail, 1987, so yeah, this was definitely in the early run of Roadrunner in the mid to late 80s.
And I'll be talking about the album later on.
Figures. But you were number 8.
My number 8 is I go back to death metal, and I'm going to freely say sometimes my research is not as good as it used to be. So if I mention an album or something that maybe doesn't belong on the list and I have my own wrong, I'll apologize now. But according to my research, I believe this is Roadrunner Records, and that would be Suffocation Pierced from Within.
Yep.
Yep. Again, this was another album that when I started getting into playing in bands and stuff, and we were doing death metal styles and stuff like that and trying to expand musically, this was one of those albums I was listening to, and it was giving me all kinds of ideas about how to differently arrange songs and play this riff a couple of times instead of just going like the old thrash metal intro, verse, chorus, bridge, lead, chorus, outro, done. 8 bars of this, 12 bars of this, 4 bars of this, blah 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 blah. You listen to something like this, it's different. It's a drum fill, guitar solo, first riff, drum fill. It just has weird arrangements to it, and the vocal delivery of the band too is different. On the sound, the third track, Thrones of Blood, has this awesome bass intro that it's got those triplets in there, and it spoke to me too. It was like, okay, I got to try to learn how to play that, and it helped me develop my style when I play music and so forth. So Effigy and the other albums that came out around that time frame with the band are definitely good, but Pierce from Within was the one that definitely called to me like, this is the fucking album I want to keep listening to. So just love it. Still listen to it to this day. I was just listening to it I think a couple months. So yeah, Pierce from Within, Suffocation, awesome stuff.
Hell yeah. So now I believe we're now moving on to number 7. My number 7 was an album Ricky had in his list, Fear Factory, Demanufacture. I thought about going Soul of a New Machine, considering that's the one I own currently, and that is definitely more death metal and grindcore than their industrial thrash groove metal that this album started with. But Demanufactured is arguably their best from top to bottom. Some may say obsolete as well, even though that had a little bit of the nu metal trimmings, but not overly nu metal, thank God. But Demanufactured, that perfect balance of thrash and groove with that industrial production. The cool thing with Fear Factory, unlike many of the other industrial metal bands early 90s 9 Inch Nails, Ministry, Godflesh, where it sounds more like industrial music with metal guitars. Right. Fear Factory was more a metal band first and foremost that incorporated industrial production. After all, this album was co-produced by Colin Richardson and Reese Folber from Frontline Assembly. So they brought in an industrial producer to record a metal record, and you can hear it. The drums have that mechanical sound. And again, Raymond Herrera, God bless you, you are a fucking beast. And, I mean, when you got songs like Zero Signal alone, Self-Bias, Resistor, Replica, and even the special editions had a great cover of Your Mistake by Agnostic Front. And even the remix remanufacture is pretty catchy with the more electronic-based stuff. And I know my buddy Kamikaze Games, Dylan Jacobs, love me for having this on the list because that's one of his favorite bands. And again, he's more of the industrial expert of the Horsemen family. But yeah, Demanufacture, number 7, but honorable mentions to both Obsolete and Soul of a New Machine. And another thing I forgot, Fear Factory, along with the band Edge of Sanity, early pioneers of doing the combination of the growling vocals and the melodic vocals.
Yes.
Can't forget that. So, pioneers in their own right for that. Ricky's number 7, on the other hand, he had, let's take a look. Interesting choice, Heaven and Hell, The Devil You Know. Basically the Dio Sabbath reunion album prior to Dio's death. Interesting choice. I've actually not quite familiar with that album, which might be blasphemy considering it's Dio's last work. But there's just so much out there. But definitely a good farewell album, I would say, for Ronnie James Dio in his life. May he rest in peace.
Very cool.
But your number 7.
Well, the 7 for me is actually a little bit off kilter metal, I guess you want to call it, because it's more hardcore sound, and that would be Life of Agony's River Runs Red.
Ooh. Yeah, the first
one again, heard this one constantly on the radio. There was a radio station near my hometown. It was the college station that would play like rock metal from like 9 to midnight, and then midnight to 3 was anything goes. So you heard Cannibal Corpse, you heard Fear Factory, you heard Sepultura, Pantera, all that stuff, but you also heard a lot of Life of Agony. Because in my area, there was a huge hardcore scene. Every band wanted to be hardcore. Yeah. And so Life of Agony got a lot of exposure. But this is another band that has that unique, or at the time, had that unique sound. You knew Caputo's voice. You knew the tone of the band. You knew their delivery, how they performed. You just turned the song on without hearing the lyrics, and you knew what band it was by the tones and the production and so forth. So it had its own identity, and that spoke volumes too. If you stick out like that, I'm going to be paying attention to you. And I think that's what caught a lot of people's eye with Life of Agony. They just released their latest album, The Sound of Scars, which pretty much is like part 2 of the River Runs Red album. I've not listened to it yet. My good buddy Walt Ball was with me right now, who does my podcast with me, the Necrocast. Huge fan of Life of Agony too. Just listened to the album. He did a review for it a few weeks ago, and he's also a huge Opeth fan too. So he knows all Opeth stuff too. So we go on and on and on about their music too. But yeah, Life of Agony, it has that hardcore sound, a lot of melancholy in the vocals, a lot of
lyrics
in there.
Oh,
lyrics
man.
are in there too. Yeah. Through and Through is my favorite track on the album. But This Time and all the great tracks on the album, classic stuff. Of course, you had the classic hardcore bands, Madball, Agnostic Front, DRI, and all that stuff too. Life of Agony kind of brought it a little bit more mainstream, but still retained that edgy grittiness that you needed to have to keep that street cred, so to speak. So I put that in there as number 7 on my list. So.
And then what's funny, like another band with that similar sound that I completely forgot about to put in honorable mentions, Biohazard, Urban Discipline, which came out the year before on Roadrunner. Yeah, both bands are like companion. They're like yin and yang. Both had their own flavor, like Biohazard having a little more of the hip-hop influence.
Yep.
Whereas Life of Agony, if I were to tag what they would be, like New York hardcore with a bit of that Pantera groove sound, with a bit of sludge, because there's some slow stuff too. Same with Biohazard, but Biohazard definitely more like the hip-hop hardcore version of Pantera, in my opinion. Like, they're just companion bands. And plus, lyrically, sad lyrics, like all about suicide and stuff, especially the closing song. I forget what it was called, like Friday, I think, where it's just basically the sound of the guy slitting his wrist, killing himself in the tub, and his mother crying. That's dark and sad. Sad way to end an album like that. Method of Groove was actually my favorite off that album because it had a little bit of that Biohazard vibe. But now we move on to the Number of the Beast, number 6. So, my number 6. Oh, Scott. You brought up Suffocation earlier, Mister. Well, the album that I chose. Well, the funny thing is, this was Roadrunner used to do this. I think they still do. With sometimes the From the Vault, where they give you 2 classics in one. So I got both Pierce from Within and Effigy of the Forgotten right here. And you know what? Fuck it. I'm changing my list. I'm going to make it a tie. Because they're both great. Even though if I had to choose one over the other, I like me Effigy, especially the vocals. Good God. Frank Mullen, I keep saying this again, another one of the greatest. Arguably number 2. Arguably second greatest death metal vocalist of all time behind, in my opinion, the best. John Tardy, who we'll talk about later on.
Yeah, but Frank, highly regarded in the death metal scene. One of the
for the super low stuff like Suffocation and Broken Hope, the 2 pioneers of the brutal death metal subgenre. and total polar opposites sound-wise. But yeah, Suffocation definitely bringing more of the technical side of the genre with the songwriting, like he brought up how they write their songs with so many different aspects where it's not verse, chorus, bridge. It's all over the place.
Yep.
I mean, with Effigy, you have the title track, Liege of Inveracity, that birthed the slam death metal movement later in the decade with bands like Devourment and Cephalotripsy. Even though I'm not a huge fan of slam, I prefer the slam moments as opposed to a whole genre being nothing but the breakdown, the slam. But luckily you had bands like Suffocation, Internal Bleeding, Broken Hope, even Mortician kind of doing it right. Even though Mortician maybe not so much about the slam, more about the gore than anything. But nonetheless, Suffocation. And then, of course, Pierce from Within, the title track, Thrones of Blood, Depths of Depravity, even the re-recording of Breeding the Spawn, which I thought about putting that in honorable mentions, the Breeding the Spawn album, because I know a lot of people don't like that album because of the production. It wasn't at more sound, but I love the production and how much more technical it was, especially with like some almost black metal blast beats as opposed to the super brutal blasts that they did on both of these albums. But tie at number 6, both Effigy of the Forgotten and Pierce from Within.
Nice.
Double disco. Oh shit. Fuck my
Whoopsie.
ass. And then of course you got the guys, and one thing a lot of people may not know, the fact that during this time, not just one, but 2 black guys in a death metal band is incredible, and they're both amazing musicians. In fact, Mike Smith, one of my biggest influences as a drummer, so no doubt about it.
There you go.
But Ricky's number 6, very interesting one, and I completely forgot about this band. Brujeria's Brujerismo. I can't speak Spanish. So I guess the first or second album by Brujeria. But yeah, I know about Brujeria. Yeah, they started out as a supergroup project with members of Faith No More, Napalm Death, and Fear Factory.
That's right.
Before eventually getting members from other bands like Carcass, At the Gates, Cradle of Filth, among so many others I can't even name off the top of my head. But death grind, grindcore, death metal, all in Spanish.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, it's very crazy. So, yeah, Brujeria for Ricky. Then again, I could see why Ricky put that, because he is half Mexican. So,
I had one of my oldest friends who I started playing death metal with. Was a guitar player and still friends with to this day, is from Chile. So he was listening to these guys a lot, and it was so much fun. Yeah, check this out, man! It's so freaking cool. Listen to like, what the hell are they saying? You don't want to know. Okay, whatever, cool. I trust you. I trust your opinion. So yeah, Brujeria, man. Wow, I haven't heard that name in a while. That's pretty cool.
But your number 6.
Well, I just talked about my buddy from Chile. We're going to stay in South America and go to Brazil. The band Sepultura, Chaos A.D. Absolutely incredible album. This album makes no bones about what it is. Doesn't try to be anything different. It's not technical in any way, and that's the way it should be. It is straightforward power thrash with grooves in there. It has, Max and Igor tag teaming together, on that album. So locked in with Andreas and Paulo Jr. I think it is.
Paulo Jr. Yep.
Thank you, on the bass there. They were just locked in with that album, and just some great. They got video airplay with that album, like Refuse, Resist, Territory, all the great tracks on there. I got to see Sepultura live on tour with Biohazard and Pantera during the Far Beyond Driven tour. It was a brutal freaking show, just so freaking good. And this was a big step for the band Sepultura, which eventually led to Max leaving.
After Roots came out,
because it was Chaos, Roots, Max leaves, Soulfly, hello, goodbye, Max.
Derek Green coming in, and then Against, and the rest is history.
The rest is history. Yep. So it definitely has a lot of influence on me too. That just that chin 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 chin. That. and the way the vocal delivery there, and just the imagery they present, and having that South American different vibe, different beat influence. We're so used to a certain way of music in North America that when you go outside, your comfort zone and get into more Middle Eastern music or South American music, there's all different kinds of drum beats and syncopations that you're just not used to, and it throws you off. But you kind of like, this is cool, like, show me more. Listen, let me hear more. Let me get more into it. And there was a lot of that album too. So I always loved Max Cavalera. He only had 4 strings on his guitar.
None of the high strings.
The IE and the high E and the B string were gone. He's like, screw it. That's what Andrea's here for. He's here to use I'm just using the.
Yeah, I'm just laying the rhythm down. Andreas does the crazy shit.
Yep, I don't do leads. That's his job. I'm just going to sit here and kick ass. So
just play the money riff.
Mm-hmm. And like Igor's drumming there, like that, and just going crazy, and he was only like, he was a kid, he was like 18,
23 when that album came out.
Was it 23? So he started in the band when he was like 16, 17, for God's sake, and just got better and better every time. So that right there was like little added gimmick, it was like another thing, like, oh my God, these guys young. It was like when Death Angel came out, and they were all young.
Yeah. And their drummer was 12 when they did their first demo, which is absolutely insane.
I think it was on the Get Thrashed documentary.
Which I have,
Yep. Yeah, they talked about those guys from Exodus. It was Zetro. So, he was 12 years old, opening for Metallica. I was like, I got to go home and do my homework because I had to go open Metallica tonight. Crazy.
That's insane.
Chaos AD, Sepultura, my number 6.
Yeah, Chaos AD, interesting, because that's definitely not my favorite Sepultura album. It is great, don't get me wrong, but I do feel like that was when they started making that transition away from their standard thrash sound into definitely more of that groove sound that they pretty much still do to this day. And yeah, it was kind of like the stepping stone to Roots. Because Roots pretty much took that, what KSAD did, but even further, and almost new metal even. But yeah, Refuse Resist, classic song, territory classic, and without that album, would groove metal or even the early metalcore sound of the 90s prior to the Kill Switch Engages and As I Lay Dyings of the world, back when you had legit metalcore of Hatebreed, Converge, All Out War, all those bands, don't think they would have gotten the influence as well if it wasn't for this album, especially Hatebreed, for example.
Yes, definitely. Mm-hmm.
But yes, Sepultura on my list. Not the same album, and we'll get to that when we get there.
Okay.
But now moving on to the second half, the top 5.
Yes. Top 5.
Ricky's number 5 is an album I have on my list a little bit later. Annihilator's Alice in Hell.
Oh, wow. Yes.
Went way back on this one. So that was 89.
89. Jeez, I'm off. Sorry.
And I'll talk more about that when I get to it. Mm-hmm. But my number 5 is actually another tie, and it's another one of the, similar to Suffocation, another of the 2 from the Vault 2 classics. Well, when you talk about Roadrunner and death metal, there's one band in my mind that comes to mind synonymous with both. None other than Obituary. Both Slowly We Rot and especially Cause of Death. I mean, their first 2, 89 and 90, are like night and day sound-wise. Both have more sound, but yet Slowly We Rot, definitely the heavier album, which is crazy to think because it's standard tuning. But hey, as Andreas Kisser says, you don't have to tune low to be heavy. Proof right here with Slowly We Rot, standard tuning, but sounding heavier than anything they've done. I mean, when you got songs, and even the namesake for a couple of bands, Internal Bleeding, Suffocation. Then again, Morbid Angel had a song called Suffocation the same time, with Altars of Madness at the same time as Slowly We Rot, so that was just a favorite title everyone wanted to use. But yeah, the namesake... Yeah, but the namesake for the band Internal Bleeding, the opening track, Godly Beings, Till Death, definitely carrying on the legacy of old Celtic Frost. And some may argue Celtic Frost is death metal, black metal, or just thrash. I think more death and thrash with a black metal production early on. But yeah, Obituary keeping on that legacy of like the more groovy, doomy type of sound. Even though it's not death doom, it's borderline because there are those slow moments, but a lot of thrash on Slowly We Rot, Deadly Intentions, Words of Evil. And then Cause of Death, which is my personal favorite of the two and my favorite Obituary album. And I remember, I think the last time I mowed grass, I was listening to the album as I was mowing grass. Speaking of Celtic Frost, one of the best covers of all time, Circle of the Tyrants on Cause of Death. The title track, Dying, Body Bag, Turned Inside Out, Chopped in Half. Oh! Gore! Gore galore! And John Tardy's voice, like I said, arguably the greatest death metal vocalist of all time, with that more higher, putrid, vomiting style that even people like Martin Van Drunen picked up on, and Mark Grew from Morgoth early on in their catalog did that too. But Cause of Death and Slowly Rot, two all-time death metal classics, and two classics for Roadrunner, and I think, even though I didn't have it on the list, but the Incomplete, the third album, 92, was at the time the highest-selling album for both death metal and Roadrunner at over 500,000 copies. So, speaks volumes to how important Obituary was to Roadrunner back in the death metal gold rush that Roadrunner was obsessed with. That's why so many death metal albums ended up on this list, because them, along with Earache and Metal Blade, were the three labels synonymous with the genre in the early years. So, it just makes sense.
There you go.
But now you're number 5, Scott.
We've already mentioned it 2 other times. My list now, Fear Factory Demanufacture. What more to be said? I mean,
exactly.
We've already touted how great this album is, the tone of it, the structure of the band, the songs, Burton C. Bell vocals, just amazing, melodious, baritone, and also the lyric content. This came out in '94. And I'm a 19, 20-year-old kid in my life at that time. I don't know what life has in store for me, what I'm going to be doing. And lyrics are all these things that try to break you to your knees. Anger scours right through your veins. Now it's time to put an end to all the lies. Now it's time to take control of your life. Like that freaking screams at you, when you're like that. And Piss Christ is my favorite track in the album. With a nod to Dog Day Sunrise, because it just like stands out so much on the album. Just like, really? there's all this brutality, and then there's like Dog Day Sunrise. Okay, cool. I just picture people, working at a factory, with singing a song. But yeah, Zero Signal, Piss Christ, just so much great stuff on that album. And I've got to see Fear Factory live as well. They performed several of those songs. And again, the vocal power of Bell is just amazing. What he can do out there. And yeah, there was problems with the band, and he had problems with a woman, and he stuff. And that's life, people. That's the way things happen sometimes. And Dino's guitar is, again, signature of the band. You know Fear Factory when you hear it. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
With Dino's type playing. And like Raymond's leg should be insured for millions of dollars with the freaking, kick drum.
Yeah.
I don't care if they were triggered. I don't care. Everyone gets triggered nowadays, but it doesn't matter. It's locked in. It's solid. It blows your mind. We listen to it, and then you can say like honorable mentions to Obsolete and all the other albums too. So definitely. And this was duking out number 5 and number 4 spot on my list. But yeah, it gives number 5.
Yeah. And even though Raymond no longer in the band, they've had 2 great drummers since. Gene Oglin, arguably one of the top 10 of all time, and even a young kid in Mike Heller, who's also in Raven of all bands, and Malignancy. Like, he's in 3 very different bands right now, and he's only 27 years old, and absolutely incredible. Like, he could play traditional heavy metal on one side with Raven, play industrial stuff with Fear Factory, and then crazy brutal tech death similar to Suffocation with Malignancy. Like,
Yep.
holy hell, how's this kid doing?
Yeah,
He's a
the whole new
talent.
crop of the whole new crop of drummers that came out in the last like 20 years are so
Yeah,
versatile. They just have all kinds of abilities. They're not locked into one specific style. Joey Jordanson, you can say. Jason Bittner from Shadows Fall is another guy who's got a lot of diversity. Can play
yep.
anything. So yeah, there's all
George
kinds.
Callias.
Yes, George Clinton, Gene Hoglan, like you said. I mean, Gene's just amazing and just is so influential in the scene and looks so just so. It's like it's nothing to him. This is butter. I don't have to do anything else. You're doing kick drums at like 360. That's not possible. Yeah, I got this. It was a double blast beating, and I'm doing that stuff. Yeah, that's okay. Whatever.
Yeah.
Dude, come on, make us look bad.
Well, while we're on to you, why don't we start with you for number 4?
Number 4 is the debut album from Machine Head, "Burn My Eyes."
Forgot about that. Then again, I may have a vendetta against Machine Head because I can't stand Rob Flynn right now. But that is a great album.
I
Completely forgot about that.
I forbode any BS from Rob Flynn over the last 5 years because this was the album that taught me how to listen to a drummer, because the drum patterns in this album are amazing, and there's not one bad song on this album. Even the song Realize, it's like second to last on the album. It's all samples of what was going on in the news at the time with gang violence and all that stuff. And the only lyrics in the song are realize, real lies, and real eyes. Didn't matter. It was still awesome. It was still great music. And again, the drum patterns, amazing. They don't take away from the song. They add to it. They don't stick out too much. It's just enough. It was absolute perfection when they made this album. And, Let Freedom Ring with the shotgun blast, iconic lyrics.
Davidian classic song.
Yeah, exactly. It brings the entire audience into it. And again, it taught me how to listen to drums and how they affect the song a lot more than, say, like certain thrash bands were that were just listening to the guitar and just kind of playing with that. This guy, the bass, the drum, they're locked in together, and Rob Flynn is doing his thing. I forget the other guitar player's name off the top of my head.
Logan Motter, I believe.
Was it Logan? Okay.
Yeah.
And they just reunited too recently. Played the entire Burn My Eyes album live. Where the hell was that? Where could it come to my town? I got to see Machine Head live, but this was after Burn My Eyes. This was getting like the next album after that and stuff like that, when they weren't really the same band. It wasn't The Blackening, I don't think, no, but it was before that. But still, highly influential album on myself. So got to show it a lot of respect at the number 4 spot on my.
Yeah. And funny enough, Ricky and I have the same album in the same spot at number 4. You brought up Gene Hoglan earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, arguably his greatest achievement musically as a drummer, the one and only album on Roadrunner Records from my number 5 favorite band of all time, the pioneers of death metal, and long may they rest in chaos, Death Symbolic. I mean, arguably the greatest death metal. Even I can't speak English sometimes. But arguably Symbolic, arguably the greatest death metal album of all time, and really carried on that more progressive death metal sound that eventually Opeth would start doing. Hell, when this album came out, Opeth was getting ready to release Orchid, their first album, and Opeth was inspired by death in their early days. And Edge of Sanity, the Opeth, the future not the future Opeth, what am I talking about? The Opeth before Opeth was Opeth, a year after put out Crimson. I know, yeah. And a year after this came out, releasing Crimson, and even Crimson 2 paying tribute to Chuck. But yeah, without Death, I don't think progressive death metal would have existed. Even Cynic as well. Atheist, you could say prog death or tech death. I'd think of them more as tech death, because they were just more all about the fretboard gymnastics all over the bass and the guitars, whereas death was more all about the songwriting, which is important. And I mean, when you got songs like the title track, Zero Tolerance, Crystal Mountain, arguably the greatest death metal song of all time. Even the closing track, Perennial Quest, had like 8.5 minutes with a beautiful acoustic ending with a little electric solo in the background. Kind of a precursor to the song Voice of the Soul on Sound of Perseverance a few years later. But yeah, Gene Hoglan, in my opinion, his best drum performance of his entire career on this album. A lot of double kick, a lot of like Neil Peart inspired like drum, odd time signature drum playing.
Mm-hmm.
And then Chuck. I mean, Chuck is Chuck. What can you say? The godfather of the genre, and great voice. Even though this was around the time when he started doing the more higher register, that was pushed further on Sound of Perseverance. But love this album, even though it's maybe not my favorite Death album. I can't deny that's arguably their best, but just not my favorite. That's a double-edged sword for me right there. But yeah, their only album on Roadrunner, which is kind of strange, and I think if I remember right, I watched a while back, before it got taken off of YouTube, the Death documentary.
Oh, yeah.
Just released, and I think if I can remember, I think the reason why they got dropped off of Roadrunner was because Chuck did not want to be all about death metal anymore.
Right.
And they were put on like this like promotional thing with Pierce from Within and other death metal Roadrunner albums like Once Upon the Cross at the same time, and he just got upset like, I don't want to be just a death metal band. We're a metal band that's going all kinds of directions. But I'd say if Chuck was alive now, he probably would look back on that whole thing with a little bit of regret and think, yeah, maybe didn't handle that the best of ways.
Well, I was looking at, he was young, thrust into.
He was late
position.
20s at the time. Still, he was still very young, and this
still
was
very young, and
sixth album
as saying, "You're the godfather of death metal." He didn't like that. He didn't want that. He felt it was a stigma, not an honor. So it's like, when you're that age and you're that driven and you have that kind of passion for any kind of art form, whatever it is, if it's music or painting or dancing or whatever it is. And you get this video making, content creating, the whole nine, pro wrestling, whatever, and you get thrust in that spotlight. It becomes like, wait a minute, this is not. I didn't want this. This isn't what I signed on for. It's a side effect. It's just something that's ancillary. You can't control it. That's the other thing about Chuck too. Big control freak. Usually the biggest geniuses are, and. Yeah. That leads to, I don't want this. Well, you can't. This is the way it is now. If you want your music to be shown around the world, you have to do it. I don't like that. Well, that's about developing and growing and maturing. And as you said, if he hadn't been taken away from us as early as he was, maybe he'd had a different attitude about it later on. Who knows? We can speculate. Undeniable his influence on the entire scene, that he is, whether he enjoyed it or not, he is the upper echelon of death metal. Bottom line.
Yeah, no doubt about it. and a guy who kind of was a similar way would have been like Jeff Walker from Carcass. Like, he always called them death metal, and I agree. I think Carcass was death metal through and through from the beginning, even if there was grind in there, and he didn't like being called grindcore because, well, Napalm Death was grindcore and he didn't want to be close. He loves the term, even though he doesn't want Carcass to be associated with that. And I feel similar to that in some veneer, because it's like, you read lyrics from Carcass, listen to like from Symphonies of Sickness to Surgical Steel, not really grindy. Maybe grind elements, but it's more just the death metal and eventually melodic death metal on hard work going forward. But yeah, even Jeff even looks back on that with a little bit of regret. So yeah, like I said, if Chuck was still alive, maybe he would take that honor of being called the godfather of death metal with a little more heart. Especially considering, look at the plethora of bands that he influenced right after they started. Cannibal Corpse, Broken Hope, Obituary, Morbid Angel. I could go on. Like, without death, and to a lesser extent Possessed, there is no death metal. Wouldn't exist. Or even Celtic Frost. Without Celtic Frost, death metal and black metal wouldn't exist. So it's all the big conundrum that us fans fall into that mindset of like, well, without these bands wouldn't exist, blah, 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 blah. Right. Yeah. Nine times out of 10, it's true. Some may argue otherwise, but Death Symbolic, number 4 for both me and Ricky. Classic progressive death metal album.
There you go.
But now we move on to number 3.
Yeah.
My number 3. Ricky had at his number 5, I believe. Yes, he did. Annihilator, Alice in Hell. I mean, one of the first albums that really got a lot of traction from Roadrunner, 89. Then again, 89 was a classic year for Roadrunner because, you had that. Slowly We Rot and Consuming Impulse. Hell, 3 albums on my list were from 89. That's insane. But
Good year. Good year.
It was a great year. But Alice in Hell, definitely a far different vibe from a lot of the other stuff at Roadrunner at the time. Progressive, technical thrash, like with a little bit of that Canadian speed metal influence, even though production was too good and the music was too tightly written to be called speed metal. Definitely more thrashy with that more progressive songwriting and technical guitar solos. Jeff Waters, in general, one of the best guitarists out there that I feel doesn't get enough credit.
He doesn't. No.
The
It's because he's Canadian.
The fact that Dave Mustaine wanted him to join the band prior to Rest in Peace should speak volumes as to how good he is on the guitar. And even Randy Rampage on vocals, Rest in Peace, who came from the Canadian punk band DOA, came in for this album on vocals. And it's amazing that with this album, Jeff did the guitars and bass on the album, while Randy did the vocals, and I can't remember who the drummer was at the time, but great music. The song Alice in Hell got heavy rotation back then. But songs like Welcome to Your Death, Wicked Mystic, just what more can you say? It's a classic album. Even Never Neverland, their second album, you could make a strong argument for being on this list too, because it was a great follow-up. And Hell Annihilator is still going strong, and they got a new album coming out in January, so they're still going. And Jeff Waters still kicking at 52, 53 years old. You old bastard. But
there's this hope for us old guys.
For Ricky's number 3, very interesting choice, Misfits' Famous Monsters. Went a little horror punk on us with that. I actually can't even remember what year. I want to assume that was like mid-90s, I believe, where Glenn wasn't in the band, I feel like, but I don't know. But that was his number 3. Scott, your number 3.
My number 3 is, it's kind of a tie, because one's legit, one's kind of eh. Number 3 for me is Merciful Fate, Melissa. Now, asterisk, Don't Break the Oath, that was Roadrunner UK. It was Combat Records in the United States. So, had to get technical there. Even though I like Don't Break the Oath more than Melissa, we're doing our top 10 Roadrunner album, going with Melissa, to stay in the theme, to make sure it's legit here. But, I mean, regardless, that is, it's the beginning of Merciful Fate. It's their first full-length album. It has that 83. Raw sound, 83. Seminal year in thrash. That's when Kill 'Em All came out. So, and all the other great albums. It's got Satan's Fall on there, all 12-minute long song from this amazing band with this crazy painted up lead singer singing about Satanism and performing these things on stage, and he has a skull and he has bones for a microphone, and it's amazing, it's incredible, and it has this incredible falsetto, and the lyrics, Curse the Pharaohs, Evil, all the great tracks on there. Melissa in and of itself is iconic. So it sets the tone for what would come later on with not just Merciful Fate, but with King Diamond too. And my number 3, 2, and 1 all have a theme to them. So they're all going to kind of be connected here. Melissa's amazing album, and just to mention Don't Break the Oath, all-time favorite track from Merciful Fate is A Dangerous Meeting, the opening track to Don't Break the Oath. And it's Don't Break the Oath gets a little bit better production-wise. There's great music and the vocals and the lyrics. Unfortunately, that would be the last album we get Into the Shadows. I don't count In the Beginning and Turn of the Vampire stuff
Yeah.
because it's not new material. That's what Hank Sherman wanted to get more poppy, and King wasn't going to put his name to that, so he left the band, and the band broke up. And he took Michael Denner and Timmy Hansen, who's an influence on me as a bass player, to help form King Diamond with Andy LaRocque and Mickey D, of course. So, and we'll get more into that in a little bit with my other two choices. But yeah, Melissa, A Merciful Fate, you got to have it if you're. I hate that. Oh my God. I can't believe I said that. I'm sorry. I apologize. I hate when guys say, if you don't have this album, you're not a thrash metal. Have this, you're a death metal. I'm sorry. I did not mean to do that. So, but definitely buy the album. You need to have this album. So, there you go.
Yeah. Now as we move on into number 2 real quick, Ricky's number 2 was Typo Negative, Bloody Kisses.
Mm-hmm.
My number 2 was the controversial one, Merciful Fate, Don't Break the Oath.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Roadrunner UK, but every website I go to see description of the album, Roadrunner is plastered all over it.
Right,
yeah, Combat in the US, but everywhere else,
mm-hmm.
Roadrunner. So that's why I would count it. But yeah, Don't Break the Oath. I mean, you mentioned the Dangerous Meeting classic, Nightmare,
Yes.
Desecration of Souls, The Oath, with that like scary beginning with the psycho music and then the death bells and the organ and
he has his own oath he created.
His own oath.
Yes.
Before it gets into the metalness.
Yep.
Gypsy that eventually Emperor covered on Into the Nightside Eclipse. Come to the Sabbath, probably the most famous song on the album.
That was the first song I ever taught myself on bass guitar. Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
So, a lot of meaning for me right there. Matter of fact, there he is, the man himself. If you go to my channel, Mr. Scott Reacts, there's some music that was released early, ultra rare tracks from Merciful Fate that a friend of mine who's a diehard Merciful Fate fan had these songs in demo form and actually gave them to King to produce and get them out there. And he actually put together music videos for them. The names escape me right now, but there's one song is called Nightmare that is on there. And it's not the same Nightmare as the song on that album. It's different. It's got some different riffs, but there's a riff to another song that's on the album now. It's like they wrote the song, but they didn't like it. They took it apart, took a couple riffs, and made other songs with that. Those reactions are on my channel too, so check those out if you're a pleasure. But so Melissa, Don't Break the Oath. I mean, just amazing stuff. I'm glad you are the man here. That album on the list, so I'm happy that I was able to still incorporate that on here. So
yeah. Well, did we get your number 2?
No, my number 2.
Okay, there we go.
You already mentioned it, and it's number 2. It is arguably, to a lot of diehard King Diamond fans, his greatest work, and this Abigail. Love the album. Absolutely, absolutely love the album, top to bottom. It was his debut at taking a story and creating an entire album around the story. He tempted it with Fatal Portrait, with the 3 songs on there, The Candle, Portrait, and and then let's take this idea, this horror story, put to music, and let's do something different with it. And boom, comes Abigail in '87. So influential is the album that he did the entire album live last year and into the beginning of this year. It's available on Blu-ray called Songs from the Dead. I have that Blu-ray. It's fantastic. He does King Diamond tracks, but then they do the entire Abigail album. They have performers on stage doing various parts of the song. His wife is singing backup vocals as well. So, and this is after King had the heart surgery and is rehabilitated. Voice is just as strong now. The guy's 60, for God's sake. Yeah. Still just as strong now as it was back in '87 when this album came out. The Family Ghost is a classic on there. Beavis and Butthead love that one.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, Count Chocula. But you got to say tongue-in-cheek stuff. If you met any of these guys, they're very sarcastic style people. So I'm sure they didn't take offense to it. But Abigail, definitely horns high to King on that list there, because I love the album. There's one other I love.
Well, let's go ahead and, real quick, Ricky's number 1 was Merciful Fate, Melissa. Oh. And I completely forgot to mention, speaking of Melissa, that's the name of my best friend on Twitter, so There we go. So, your number one, Mr.
My number
Scott
one,
Reacts.
only released 2 years later, Conspiracy. Yep. 1989. We said before, there's good albums that came out in 89, and this was...
Yep.
It's my number one because it is my number one. It is King Diamond album because it is the album that introduced me to King. Like yourself and your brother Drew, rest in peace. I had a very good friend who was as close of a brother that you could have. And I met him in high school. We bonded over pro wrestling. And eventually he started getting me into a lot of the bands I was listening to. I went to his house one time and he said, wait a second, close the door. And he goes under his bed and he pulls out this small little briefcase. What the hell is this? Opens it up. It's loaded with cassettes. He says, don't tell my parents you saw this. His parents were diehard religious people. And in this briefcase were albums and artists a little bit more satanic, evil, demonic, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And in this briefcase was Deicide Legion, where I got the influence from. Various other albums too, and in here too was Conspiracy. And he pulled that tape out, and you see the album cover, which is just King with that amazing makeup job, with that distraught look on his face, and you're instantly mesmerized. Like, what is this about? And he started telling me what King Diamond was and the kind of music he did. And I was a big kind of pseudo band geek at the time. I was in chorus in high school. My girlfriend played in the orchestra and the band, and I was hanging around the band room a lot. So I was getting into orchestral and classical music. He said, this is kind of like rock, like metal opera. You know, I'm like, what? And I take that thing home, the first notes from At the Graves, that dun, 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 dun. I'm like, what am I listening to here? And the way he would change his voice to personify a character and the storyline. And then I listened to Them, which I love Them, but the production's horrible. Just bottom line. It's so mid-level. It's really bad. This album, they found the bass. They found the balls. So they were able to, they made it stronger. Just layers and layers of storyline and all that stuff. And that led me to backlog into Them, into Abigail, Fatal Portrait, Merciful Fate, because I was listening to King first before I was listening to Merciful Fate. Into the Eye, Spider's Lullaby, and then Into the Shadows with Merciful Fate coming out. I got to see Merciful Fate my first time. It was their first night of their tour for In the Shadows. It was near my hometown, and it was on my sister's birthday, actually, September 8th, 1993. Still remembered. I had the T-shirt. From that concert. It's ratted to shit, but I still got the T-shirt. I don't even think I can fit in it anymore. So that just led to my love and admiration for King to this day. Diehard King Diamond fan, always will be, always love him. And just no more need be said. Conspiracy, King Diamond, my number one album.
All right, well, I kind of gave away what my number one was by accident. I was wiping my beard and I held the album in my hand. So, fucked up on my part, but I brought up Sepultura earlier. My number one, I also have the shirt in the closet over there. Mm-hmm. My favorite Sepultura album, Arise.
I thought so.
Fucking masterpiece. Like, I could have gone Beneath the Remains, but I prefer Arise because there was just a little more diversity. Mm-hmm. Beneath the Remains, don't get me wrong, classic late 80s thrash. Mm-hmm. No question. But Arise, to me, the production was a little bit better since it was done properly, had more sound, whereas Beneath the Remains, Scott Burns did it while in Brazil. This time around, they're in...
Pretty cool.
It's pretty killer, man. It's pretty killer. But, oh, Lord. Damn,
somebody saw the Cannibal Corpse 20-year anniversary.
Yep, I have that DVD, which is
so do I.
one of the best. One of the best documentaries ever.
Love that one.
But yeah, Arise, to me, just spoke to me a little bit more because you had some mid-tempo and slower stuff. Like, I can get the comparison, like, people compare Beneath the Remains to Slayer, Rain and Blood because it's all speed.
Yes.
This, I get some people would compare to, like, South of Heaven or Seasons in the Abyss because it's more mid-tempo and fast, but I mean, you got great songs. The title track, probably my favorite Sepultura song of all time. Their thrashiest, one of the scariest music videos at the time with the guy in the gas mask on the cross with fire all around, and even Dead Embryonic Cells, the music video for that was quite eerie. Desperate Cry, kind of bringing a little bit of that hardcore influence from their early years. Hell, that song was so good that it was on Talladega Nights. Portion of it during the ending race with Ricky Bobby and John Gerard, which is funny. Song Murder, kind of keeping that thrash sound going. And then you get to more mid-tempo stuff like Altered State, Under Siege, Regna Mire, Meaningless Movements, Infected Voice ending on a thrash note. This version, however, I got their classic cover of Motorhead's Orgasmatron.
Yes.
As well as an intro track, Criminals in Uniform, and a Scott Burns mix of Desperate Cry, which is not quite as good as what was on here, but still a good mix. I mean, after all, Scott Burns alone, we could do maybe someday with the rest of the guys on the show, do a whole episode just about Scott Burns and how influential he's been on extreme metal production, whether it's death metal, thrash metal, groove metal, you name it, he's done it back in the late 80s till the late 90s.
Yep.
I wish he was still going, making albums, but I could get why he stopped, because he was getting over-flooded with bands coming in.
Yeah, wasn't making any money from it.
Yeah, but he's just done such an excellent job. Like, hell, if we were to maybe do top 10 producers in metal, I would automatically say Scott Burns number 1.
Scott Burns, oh yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
But even though he got derided thanks to the Norwegian bands, well, then again, not the biggest black metal fan here, but I do like Mayhem, I do like Emperor, Dark Throne, Immortal, a little bit of Burzum, but I like to listen to music, not just shitty tape recordings, even if some of it's good, most of it not so much.
Right.
But nonetheless, Arise by Sepultura, I mean, hell, the Cavalera brothers just in their early 20s at this point, which is insanity.
Yep.
I mean, Max and Igor, arguably the best brotherhood in metal history.
Yep.
I mean, and even though they went through some bad blood and then eventually got back over a decade ago, even to the point where they're open to reuniting with Sepultura sometime, which please let that happen, because personally, Derek Green, as much respect I have for you, I'm sorry, but your material with Sepultura will not be nearly as good as Roots on back to Morbid Visions. Yeah. I'm sorry. But Arise, number 1 for Roadrunner, my favorite Sepultura album, and arguably top 5 favorite thrash album, because thrash is my bread and butter. Hell, why do you think I call myself Thrash Maniac? Exactly. But nonetheless, man, we got more out of this episode than I thought we would for a two-man show.
Well, only two of us.
This might have been. This is one of our.
You can't get me to shut up. That's the problem.
Well, hey, it certainly helped to help make this episode feel a lot more, because I honestly thought we were maybe going to go 45 minutes at most. But we managed to get an hour and a half at this, which is impressive. Absolutely impressive. So we'll definitely have to have you back again someday, man. And
I'd love to be on the whole crew. That'd be fun.
Yeah, and maybe eventually become a permanent member and be on every show, granted, if everyone else comes in all together. Because remember, we got 2 people from Europe, and time zones are an absolute whore. So, and partially the reason why nobody else was here. So, yeah, very rare occurrence, a 2-man show for the Horsemen podcast, and I bet probably won't get as many views because of that, but
that's
we'll see. But nonetheless, so reminder to those who watch the show regularly, as far as what we got planned for the future, I know the next episode we're hitting Ricky's breaking point. We're doing top 10 AC/DC songs next. He's going to cry himself to death, just like I did for Metallica. And then I believe after that, I want to say we'll have Cover Killer Nation on for progressive metal albums, because Cover Killer is going to be going away after this year. So I'd like to get him on for one appearance. Depending on when that happens, it'll be sometime this month for sure. Don't know when in the month. I gotta talk to Mark about it. Then after that, I believe the episode we'll do after that will be the top 10 albums of the year list, which will be in December. So that's going to be a bloodbath for me and for the rest of us, because this year, I'm not going to lie, this year, one of the best years in the decade for metal, and not just for the mainstream stuff, but I've gotten into so many underground bands like Bastard Grave from Sweden, Entrails, so many others that some might even make the top 10, which is insane. I mean, And before we end the episode, I want to mention about with this year, I've noticed a few trends. Swedish death metal's coming back strong this year because Entombed AD finally got their heads out of their asses and stopped doing death and roll, going back to what they were good at in the early 90s, and made one of the best albums in their career, even as Entombed AD. Then a couple other Swedish bands. Entrails put out a great album recently. Bastard Grave doing an independent Bandcamp release, and it sounds incredible. So yeah, it's like Sweden's coming back in the death metal world this year, which is awesome. Other trends I've noticed, some deathcore actually has shocked me this year at how good it is. Like Thy Art Is Murder and Carnifex, two primary examples of great deathcore, and deathcore is usually a genre I don't care for. Same with modern metalcore, but deathcore's making a comeback. Metalcore, on the other hand, like the mainstream ones like Killswitch and As They Lay Dying, kind of starting a downward spiral, whereas the original metalcore of like Ringworm and All Out War are helping to make the original metalcore sound come back in full swing, because those two albums this year were absolutely brutal and fucking heavy. Particularly probably All Out War, considering it sounds like if a New York hardcore band was influenced by Obituary and Slayer. So I mean, this year's been absolutely incredible, and even the classic mainstream bands making comebacks, like Rammstein, for example, and that's a great album. Slipknot with a new album this year. Opeth, how can you forget Opeth? And like an hour before we started recording, I posted my Nile review. Not as good as I would have imagined, but still a great album. And we're still not even done. There's still a couple big releases. We got Blind Guardian next week, Cattle Decapitation at the end of the month, which I cannot wait for, considering the two singles I've heard are so earworm infesting. I love it. So we still got, December's basically going to be a little bit of a quiet month, as most things are in December, which is why in December will be the top 10 episode, probably early, mid-December, definitely before Christmas, so nobody has to get their panties in a bunch.
Yeah, we usually do our top 10 on the Necrocasticon podcast. Can I plug my stuff, if that's okay?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And before you plug, I would like to ask, how can I get on an episode sometime of that show?
Oh, you're going to be on. I'm getting you on. It's simple.
Thank you. I'll have to get Skype again, because I have not used Skype in about 2 years.
Yeah, we're old. We use Skype, sorry. But, yeah, I will definitely have the guys, I want to have you on there, and we'll get you on.
Thank you.
So the show that he's talking about, the podcast I do, is called the Necrocasticon. It's like Necronomicon, but podcasting. And we talk horror and heavy metal. We do it every single Monday on the Project Entertainment Network. We discuss books, authors, movies, TV shows, albums, artists of all kinds in both horror and metal. Sometimes when we first started the podcast, we were finding the common connection between the two of them. Like our very first episode 4 years ago, we've done this every single week for 4 years, was about Hellraiser, the song from, the Motorhead version of Hellraiser and the movie. And then also talk about the novel as well. So that was kind of like the jumping off point for the episode, for the podcast. And nowadays, we talk about like stuff that's relevant on television these days, like Shudder's Creep Show, which is amazing. Yeah. Reviews of various albums of all different kinds. We have doom side of metal and stoner metal. We have death metal. We have prog rock. We have all kinds of stuff that's out there. We do B movie reactions, or B movie versus a wrestler is actually the review, because 3 out of the 4 of us on the show are actually former pro wrestlers. And the other guy was a super fan. So we all have history in the business. And so we delve into that territory sometimes too. So the Necrocasticon is on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Necrocasticon. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Scott Reacts. And you can find my YouTube channel, Mr. Scott Reacts, where I do reactions to music and trailers and you name it. I love reaction stuff. I've been a fan of reaction channels and the reaction community for quite a while, and just found like something fun to do. And thanks to this gentleman right here, Thrash Maniac 99, Curtis Candy and Spaz Boys Comedy. Both these guys gave me plugs and gave me respect on the internet and got me a lot of subscribers. So I thank you very much, sir, and I thank my buddy Curtis for helping me out with that. And in turn, I plan to help you out as much as I can as well. This has been an absolute pleasure. I had a great time on here. Love to come back on the show, and I can't wait to get you on Necrocasticon and have some fun on.
Oh, yeah, that is going to be a fucking amazing. Of course, I have to remind myself, make a new Skype account or try and figure out my old one that I used to have a ton of people on.
Well, we can call your cell phone, too. We can do that.
Well, yeah, there you
just do audio. We don't do videos.
Well, that is a good point. That is a good point.
We're all really ugly. We don't want to bases on.
Well, I don't think you are. You're quite the handsome devil. Then again, I call myself when I used to do the King Fat character, I used to call myself the sexual fat ass with a PH. And I need to remind myself to bring King Fat back into a video at some point. Hell, I thought about, because up there I got my little baby Groot action figure from Walmart. That was a Walmart exclusive that I actually got from Amazon. I've been thinking about wanting to do, because my buddy Kamikaze Games does the Tails and Kenny show, Tails from Sonic, Kenny from South Park, because he got plushes of those, and just does the most stupid, retarded, most fucked up shit, and it's fucking hilarious. He tries to do voice acting for him. I've been thinking about wanting to do something like that with the King Fat character. And, well, King Fat's another person. I'm not him. Wink, wink. And Baby Groot, where he just goes, I am Groot. And then King Fat tries to figure something out. I don't know. It'd probably be like a 5-minute mini show. I don't know. I don't know anybody who would want to see that, but I just want to entertain myself and just butcher my penis off, but what can you say? Not to mention, we're both perverted fucks, and that's good.
Exactly.
So any anti-male feminists out there, get your heads out of your asses, for God's sake.
That's right. So, and I must say, being an older gentleman, it is great to see a younger man like this who is so entrenched and so passionate about the music that I love. So the future is bright. The future is bright. It's in good hands.
Yeah, and the show, over 200, maybe 300 albums, and still need to get more. There's just so much out there, and so little time. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this episode. Thank you who have been watching the premiere, as this, where we recorded this November 1st on a Friday night. This will be premiering live on Saturday afternoon at noon, and probably up until 2 o'clock. So thank you guys who watched the premiere or the archive after it was done. But yes, reminder, next episode, top 10 AC/DC songs, when we can try and get the rest of the gang back on board, when they're all available after all time zones and shit. But anyways, and thank you so much, Scott, for stopping by, even though it was a one-on-one show, but what an episode it turned out to be. Probably one of my top 3 favorites so far, and we've done over 20 of these.
Wow.
In a year and a half. It's like, yeah, we would do it every week, but we all got future jobs and shit, so we just try whenever we can. But hey, at least this has been the longest lasting show I've had on this channel, because I typically tend to get lazy and forget about doing shows, and they just fall off the face of the planet. But I'm so glad this one's still going strong, and even with a one-on-one episode, we got one of the best out of that. So I want to thank you so much, Scott, for coming in.
My pleasure.
And absolutely awesome. You're a hell of a dude. And once again, his channel is in the description box. You can go subscribe to him, and then from there, go follow him on Twitter and all this and that. The Necrocasticon podcast, which I'm definitely looking forward to come on there at some point and discuss the love of metal.
Yes.
So thank you guys for watching. Keep it metal. Peace out. And I will see you if I'm not already dead. And I know Hannah, I know her opinion about this, but I'm sorry. Number 4, Ghost prequel.
Screw you! Screw you! Die! Die! Okay.
Get out!
No, I cannot continue.
Now she's gone.
Hannah, I'm sorry. I'm gonna probably
That's my number 3 request.
You have no idea about music.
Okay.